Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we are welcoming one Jennifer DuBois, who comes to us from the state of Texas, here to talk about her second novel.
That's right.
And it is called Cartwheel, published by Random House. Welcome aboard.
Thanks for having me.
One of the things that the little biographical note on the back jacket says, you had a very acclaimed debut of a novel, and the title of that was A Partial History of Lost Causes. That sounds very sociological.
Sociological?
So some kind of, sounds very scientific to me.
Mm-hmm. That's why I went with a short title for the second one. I figured it would be a little bit easier for people to...
Oh, yeah, you went all the way here.
Mm-hmm,
yes. This novel is called Cartwheel. Yeah, and it's not explained very well. You have to go quite a ways in the book before you get an explanation. And at the end, you get a definitive explanation of the title and where it came from. So we're not going to talk about that. Let them find it. Let them buy 2 copies and read. And you've been a finalist for the Penn Hemingway Award for debut fiction, winner of the California Book Award for first fiction and the Northern California Book Award for fiction. And the Oprah magazine chose your book, the first one, as one of the 10 best books of the year. Are we getting anywhere with the second book here in terms of awards and so forth?
No, not yet, but it did just come out last month, so a couple weeks ago, so we'll see.
Okay.
But Oprah hasn't called yet, so.
Well, could you call Oprah while we're on the air and see if has she gotten the book yet?
I don't know. I don't have any updates about Oprah yet.
They send you out on the road and forget about you. That's the whole problem with book publishing. This book can be described briefly as a brilliantly imagined and addictively suspenseful novel about an American foreign exchange student arrested for murder, the desperate father determined to win her freedom, and also the mother. The brilliant lawyer tasked with her prosecution, and the Sphinx-like young man who happens to be her only alibi. That's a very explosive combination, as it turns out. Well done.
Thank you. Yeah, I liked the idea of telling this story through the prism of different people who see the main character, Lily Hayes, very differently. Some of them see her as very benign and naive, and, her kind of awkward mistakes that she makes, they think are ultimately very innocent and innocuous. And other people see the same kinds of gestures as very sinister and callous and ultimately kind of possibly, representative of some capacity for homicide. So I liked the idea of using the shifting points of view to sort of give a very different kind of kaleidoscopic look at the same person and the gestures that she does.
Yeah, and as a result of that, where is the truth and what is the truth? It becomes what you're trying to find. It's the mystery.
Yeah, and how do we
ways.
Sort of shape the narratives that we come to believe, and what information, sort of goes into making us think what we do.
The other thing about this book is that it bears several semblances to the real-life story of Amanda Knox, who was an American foreign exchange student accused, convicted, and acquitted, finally, of murdering her roommate. This was set in Italy. Mm-hmm. And how does that relate? I mean, in terms of your writing, how does that relate?
Well, what really captured my imagination initially about the Amanda Knox trial years ago was the degree to which people seem to believe very different things about Amanda Knox, but with equal levels of fervor and stridency. So
certitude.
Exactly.
Yeah.
People were, I think I heard so many people say, that girl was railroaded. She's totally innocent. It's glaringly obvious, 100% certain. And then, an equal number of people would say there's something wrong with her. Like, I can just tell that she's a sociopath. But the level of certainty was what interested me. So I liked the idea of exploring that phenomenon of a person who just animates very different reactions in the people around her, and exploring that phenomenon through the template of a totally fictional world with totally fictional characters. But that was sort of the spark of that initial interest, was just, how people can look at the same person and see completely different things.
The way that relates to Knox, the way your book relates to the Knox story, what kind of a spark is provided, you answer that question beautifully in an author's note that they sent along, and I want to read it. You say, I've come to appreciate how entirely my view of writing and reading fiction is based on a single moral premise, that the act of imagining the experience of fictional people develops our sense of empathy as well as our sense of humility in regarding the experiences of real ones. To me, the fictional barrier around the characters in this book isn't just a necessary prerequisite for trying or even wanting to write a novel about the fallibility of perception. It's also fundamental to my notion of fiction's ethical possibilities in the world. Beautifully said. Oh,
thank you. I really agonized over that because it means a lot to me. So
yeah, I'm glad they sent it along. This is not in the book itself, is it?
It is. Yeah, it's in the.
Is it? I'm sorry.
Just a little author's note at the end of the book, because people will have questions, of course, with the relationship, and I was
totally tired when I got to the end of the book, so I went to bed without reading the author's note. So when you guys out there buy the book, read the author's note first.
That would be wonderful.
It'll reveal something to you, not just about the writer, but the issues that are kind of behind the book. We'll have some more fun with this book when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
The title of our book today is Cartwheel, and it's not a book about gymnastics. It's a novel, a very intriguing one with a very different kind of tilt to it, I would say. And the author, Jennifer DuBois, nice enough to join us, compliments of the folks at Random House. And Maggie Shipstead, New York Times bestselling author of Seating Arrangements, has this in part to say about this book. Jennifer DuBois, a writer whose fierce intelligence is matched only by her deep humanity, hits us with a marvelous second novel that intertwines a gripping tale of murder abroad, and an intimate story of family heartbreak. Every sentence crackles with wit and vision. Every page casts a spell. Do you want to send another check to her, or did you pay her? No, that's great. That's great. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Well, she is a good friend, but.
And we mentioned in the first segment that one of the interesting things about this book, in terms of its approach, is that different chapters the story is told by different people. And the reason for that is that the goal, if you will, is to talk about how facts and truth are seen and perceived differently by different people. And the place to begin with respect to this novel, I think, is with the family. How do the family members see what's going on? Starting with Dad.
Right. It opens with Andrew, Lily's father, on the plane to Buenos Aires, and he knows that his daughter has been arrested for this murder, and he is very, very convinced, of course, of her innocence. He thinks of how he almost was relieved to hear that the accusation was murder, because he could imagine.
So silly.
Right. He could sort of imagine that she might get in trouble for, trespassing or possibly, marijuana use or something, but he could never fathom. And so he's completely convinced of her innocence. And he's traveling with his daughter, Anna, his other daughter, who's kind of always been a little bit left in the shuffle behind Lily. And then we move on to the point of view of the prosecutor, Eduardo, who is, kind of convinced with equal fervor of Lily's guilt. It really sort of clinches for him when he sees the photographs that she's taken and Buenos Aires, which sort of have her kind of inappropriately dressed in front of a church, and she's taken pictures of a little deformed child, and he sort of sees this very callous, very kind of calculating consciousness in these photographs. So
almost, I felt sometimes when I was reading it that he sees her as the ugly American.
Right, exactly.
And, I have these rights, I have these powers, I have this money, and
Right. He sees this sort of arrogance and this entitlement in her, which is perhaps not inaccurate, but also not, of course, the whole story.
No, in no way is it total.
Right.
What is total is this guy Eduardo. Now, Eduardo is the prosecutor, but he's a very sensitive, troubled guy, and you show both sides, his abilities as a prosecutor and the mind that he's in, or the mindset that he's in.
Yeah, Eduardo was a character that in a way he was the hardest one for me to write, because he thinks probably more differently than the way I think than any of the other characters do. But it was very important to me that he be guided by moral precepts that he was taking very seriously. And so that we, even if we don't necessarily come to the same conclusions that he does, we can sort of understand how he is operating in good faith and in sincerity. And in that way, I was hoping that, readers will come to their own conclusions about what the truth is, but they'll be able to sort of follow along with the thinking of each character.
Another important character whom we must not forget, Sebastian Lecomte. Tell us about Sebastian Lecomte, who lives in a deteriorating mansion.
Sebastian was great fun to write. He's Lily's sort of boyfriend or paramour who lives next door, and he's this kid whose parents were killed when he was a teenager, and he's sort of very rich and has sort of retreated into this personality of kind of half ironic affectation, and
he has a wise mouth. That's what we would say years ago. It's a wise mouth. He cannot make a straight statement.
He cannot to save his life.
Yeah. Would you like a hamburger or a hot dog? Well, the nutritional elements involved in meat, and on before he would give you a decision, if he'd give you a decision. So he's the one that our friend Lily falls in love with.
Right.
I think she falls in love.
Well, exactly. I mean, he falls in love with her, but has a hard time. It's sort of the boy who cries wolf a little bit. By the time he tells her that, she doesn't really have any basis for believing anything he says. And so she's sort of skeptical about it.
Lily is, to me, a kind of problem. I wanted to like her a lot more than I found myself able to like her. And I think that's partly due to the way you've written her. Mixed bag.
Oh, absolutely. Very. Yeah. I mean, I think, I'm sort of fond. I can never not be fond of any of my characters just because I spend so much time with them,
Not allowed.
But, she's very young, I think. I mean, she's just very kind of, maybe even a little younger for her age than, she's very volatile and very kind of impulsive and, well-intentioned, but, just not done yet in terms of her growing up.
No, and as a result of that, she's very inconsistent.
Right.
She can be charming, she can be helpful, she can be industrious, and she can be equally all the opposite of those things.
And she's very, very unaware of how she's perceived. She thinks she means well, and it's hard for her to grasp that this isn't always visible to other people, and that they don't know what she means. They just know what she does and says, and that always doesn't line up.
The other interesting person in here who has a very minor role is Eduardo's wife, Maria. And she comes in, kind of takes charge of him for a while, and then they separate again.
Yeah, and he sort of sees her as, in some ways, a motivation. He really wants this, victory, and also this what he sees as a moral victory in some ways is to her.
You know, the writing in this book is really, really good. And when we return, we'll prove it.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Jennifer DuBois is our guest today. She's here to talk about her latest novel called, of all things, Cartwheel. That's what we have to cover in the last segment. I just thought of it. Where does that title come from? Why don't we start with that, and then we'll go to the reading.
Well, the title comes from this cartwheel that Lily Hayes performs in her initial interrogation after she's been questioned.
Say that again, please. She's being interrogated by the cops.
Right.
In a country foreign to her.
Right. She's been arrested.
And the way she's going to show what a cool customer she is, she ends the interrogation by doing a cartwheel.
Well, maybe. She does it, it's caught by the security camera. So it's after she's been interrogated. And so, but exactly, some people think, is this, the kid just wants to stretch? She's been cooped up for 12 hours and, this is just, other people think, how callous, right?
You not only have her doing it, you have the excuses for doing it.
Right. Well, because that's it. So that's why it's the title, is because it's exactly this gesture that half the characters see as, just so callous.
An outburst of youth. And so
right.
forth.
Some people see it as an outburst of youth, and just so naive. But in a strange way, some people see it as actually evidence of her innocence, because only an innocent person would be so dumb as to do something like that. Other people see it as very callous. So that's...
What did your editor say when you called up and said, I'm sending in the MS for my next novel, and it's going to be called Cartwheel?
Well, my agent came up with the name, and I loved it because I thought it really, because the cartwheel is kind of a minor incident, but it kind of encapsulates the different.
Yeah.
And I didn't know whether they were going to like it, but I think they were just so glad to have one concrete noun instead of like 17 abstract nouns in a title that it's memorable. So.
Well, not only did you write, or your agent wrote, good of you to give him credit, but you also write very well, and I'd like you to share some of that with our listeners. And this comes at a place somewhere in the middle of the novel, mm-hmm. as much as they're going to, things are settling down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is in the sort of middle of Lily's time abroad before her roommate is murdered. So this is from the time before that. Somehow Lily's days were beginning to trace the same emotional arc over and over again. She'd wake up in the mornings feeling jaunty and electrified, thrilled by her own life. She was young and nothing was really nailed down yet. It was true she was no longer a virgin, it was true she was no longer undeclared, but really, in the broadest sense, anything was still possible, and what a wonder that was. She walked around the city in the afternoons, watching herself in the third person, alone at cafes, at museums, and she mostly saw the person she had always wanted to watch herself be, a person for whom all the best things were still ahead. This feeling came back to her at nights as she walked back to the Carrizos from Fuego or from Sebastian's, the lights of the city shimmery and seductive all around her. There was absolutely nothing like a city at night. It was so easy to believe that everything that could possibly happen was happening somewhere right around her, just behind a closed door, just beyond her field of vision. And for all she knew, it was. But between the mornings and the evenings, something was going wrong. A feeling came pricking at Lily in the late afternoons, when the sun turned a certain sickening rubescent color, casting light that made all the buildings look like glowing cinders. In those hours, Lily felt that she was kidding herself, that some central fiction of her life was growing worn with overuse, and that one day it would tear through completely. She would fall into a shaky melancholy then, as though coming down with a strange late-in-the-day hangover, and would have to go somewhere bright and capitalist and unreal to try to cheer herself up. Sometimes she'd find herself at a Chango Mas staring at the children's cereal, or at the movies watching dubbed American films that seemed to always use the same voiceover actors. She generally tried to stay away from email. It made her life in Argentina feel contingent and small and less urgent somehow. She was on the other end of the world, and she wanted to feel like it. But sometimes in these afternoon moods, she'd succumb to a kiosco where she'd spend a couple of hours reading blogs devoted to badly written expressions of widely held opinions. She'd watch the irradiated globes of the computers grow brighter and brighter against the falling darkness. Then evening would come, and she would walk out into the streets and gulp the still warm air. She'd remember that she was so far away from home that she could actually wear a tank top in February. She'd take off the sweater she'd worn against the air conditioning in the kiosco or the theater or the store. There would be a mild breeze against her shoulders, and she would feel it creakily cantilever her into the evening. Her old innate optimism would return. She would sense, with the tender and turbulent joy of a granted reprieve, that her life was not yet over, and she would begin to feel much better.
What I like about that passage, among other things, is that it really gives the reader the feeling that we're talking about a very real young person, that, there are wonderful things there and some things that are scary, almost scary, and so on. Anything was still possible. All doors are open, but, and it's the but that the novel really focuses on.
The doors are open, but sort of beginning to close behind her in ways she doesn't know yet. And
And what she does or doesn't do depends upon, it seems to me, the people who are looking at what she does. And we get back to what we talked of in the first segment, and that is that what you wanted to do here was, in a sense, leave it open, leave the meaning of it open.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to leave readers able to sort of make their own conclusions. Ironically, I don't think it's that open. I feel like it's kind of clear to me what the truth of the situation is, but I love that readers see it differently. That speaks to the ambiguity of the character, I think.
It shows good skill.
Thank you. And
a lot of courage. And this is a book you don't want to miss. It's a novel with a strange title, created by the agent.
Thanks, Henry.
It is Cartwheel. The author, Jennifer DuBois, has been with us today on Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.